Welcome back to Unfair Housing. I'm Alicia Magazoo. Joining me today is Quinn Chavis and Alec Rose. Today we'll be talking about the Roaring '20s, followed by the Great Depression and the impact they had on housing and ultimately the development of suburbia. As a reminder, this podcast is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion of the history of housing segregation and housing discrimination, nor is it meant to create division or instill guilt, but rather to educate our listeners on what shaped our neighborhoods and our social perspectives so we can be better guided in our efforts to improve our future and avoid repeating the mistakes of our past. As always, remember discrimination is a heavy topic, so please take care throughout this journey and pause the episode to take a breath if needed. Also, we welcome comments and lively discussion on the topics we raise, but we ask that kindness and consideration be used when making and responding to comments, and that you refrain from using threatening or violent language. All right, so let's get started by taking a look at the state of the economy following World War I. At this time, many countries were struggling financially. While the U.S. felt some of that economic slump, the 1920s marked a time of great prosperity for many in the United States. The rise of the Second Industrial Revolution caused an economic boom. It was fueled in part by the expansive use of electricity in homes and factories, causing many Americans to move into urban areas to be closer to their jobs, which also incidentally created some mixed-race neighborhoods. The economic boom was also fueled by the introduction of the assembly line, which led to a substantial increase in automobile production, which then led to expanding the country's transportation infrastructure, something we'll discuss in more detail in a later episode because it had a significant impact on housing segregation. While the 20s marked a decade of great advancement and prosperity, it also marked the introduction of some very notable practices against non-white and what some labeled as unwelcome Americans. It was around this same time when Black Americans in the South began to migrate north in search of employment and a new way of life, a time commonly referred to as the Great Migration. We'll touch on this subject several times over the course of this season because it had a significant influence on housing segregation. Also around this time, there was a surge in immigration in the U.S., which led to a revival of the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, a group of white nativists that denounced African Americans, Catholics, Jews, foreigners, and organized labor. The KKK organized marches, they engaged in violence against minorities, and they burned crosses to convey their white supremacy message. At its peak, the KKK had over 4 million members in the U.S. As immigration soared, Congress took its own measures to reduce the number of foreigners entering the U.S. by passing the Immigration Act of 1924, also referred to as the Johnson-Reed Act, which set a quota on the number of Eastern and Southern Europeans who could immigrate to the U.S. and effectively banned Asians from entering altogether. This remained the law until 1965, over 40 years later. But as the end of the 1920s neared, so too did the U.S.'s prosperity. Let's take a look at how. One factor that attributed to the economic boom of the 20s was the stock market. In the mid to late 20s, the stock market rapidly expanded, causing many to withdraw their cash from banks and invest it in the stock market, while some even sold off more stable bonds and used equity from their homes to invest in the stock market. But near the end of 1929, the stock market took a turn, ultimately crashing in October. The result? Many middle and lower class families suddenly found themselves out of money, assets, and equity and unable to pay their debts. It wasn't just individuals who suffered financially at this time, though. By the 1930s, foreign trade provided additional options for goods that were offered at lower prices, which increased competition for American businesses. American businesses responded by lobbying Congress to raise the tariffs on these cheap foreign goods. Many other countries followed suit, and foreign trade was dramatically reduced, as were U.S. exports. And as Americans began purchasing less, the prices of goods fell, businesses began laying off workers to account for the changing economic climate, and it became apparent a significant recession was on the way. At the same time, many banks were heavily leveraged in the stock market, so as the market climate changed, so did the viability of banks. As banks began to fail, people began to panic and withdraw money from their accounts. This reduced the ability of banks to lend and reduced the amount of cash available for withdrawal. These economic changes and many others led to the Great Depression as 1929 came to a close, which left many families out of work and struggling to make ends meet. One of the most impacted groups were Black Americans. They were the first to see reduced wages and job cuts, and they were also less likely than white families to have financial reserves, which we explained in detail in the prologue episode. If you haven't had a chance to check that out yet, I highly recommend you do. But white Americans were also severely impacted by the Great Depression. So how did the government respond? Following the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, also known as FDR, in 1932, a series of government programs were implemented to address the failing economy and to induce prosperity. The collection of legislation and programs was named the New Deal. The New Deal did many things, one of which was to repair the failing bank deposit system by establishing the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, to protect deposits with a government guarantee if a bank failed. Additionally, the Social Security Act was passed to help aid seniors, the disabled, and the unemployed. And of great significance to our discussions, FDR implemented housing programs under the New Deal as well. The Great Depression created 3 issues in housing, all of which we'll discuss in further detail over the next few episodes. 1. Homeowners with mortgages were falling behind on payments and facing foreclosure. 2. At the time, purchasing a home and borrowing to do so required upwards of 50% down, the loans were interest-only loans, and the loan repayment periods were less than 10 years, terms that are much different than what we're familiar with today. Such steep borrowing terms and the financial circumstances of many Americans at the time created a third issue, which was a housing shortage caused by low demand, something that wasn't a problem at the time, but would be as the economy began to recover. To address the first issue, the FDR administration created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which purchased loans in foreclosure and issued new loans with longer repayment terms. The HOLC also introduced the amortization schedule for mortgage payments, which applied a portion of a borrower's mortgage payment to the principal balance due on the loan and not just toward the interest the borrower owed, thus creating a way for homeowners to gain equity in their home over time simply by making monthly payments. But the HOLC was assuming risk with this structure. So to help evaluate the level of risk of purchasing these loans, it hired real estate agents to determine the property value of the home secured by the loan. We'll discuss this practice in more detail later, but real estate agents at this time had a requirement in their ethics code to maintain segregation. So by hiring real estate agents to determine property values, the HOLC also took the racial makeup of neighborhoods into account when determining its risk. The result? The HOLC created color-coded maps of cities. Neighborhoods considered low risk were color-coded green, and neighborhoods colored red were high risk. If a neighborhood was mostly made up of Black residents, the area was labeled risky and color-coded red, regardless of the financial situation of the occupants. This practice became known as redlining. To address the second issue involving barriers to new homeownership, Congress and FDR established the Federal Housing Administration in 1934. The FHA implemented a mortgage insurance program that would cover 80% of the cost of a new home purchase. The loans had repayment terms of 20 years, and as described before, the payments made toward the loan would apply a portion of the payment to interest and a portion to principal, allowing borrowers the opportunity to gain equity while the home was mortgaged. Like the HOLC, the FHA too assumed risk with this program, so it conducted appraisals to evaluate that risk. The FHA was equally as blatant, if not more so, in its exclusion of Black borrowers in its program. The FHA went so far as to include a requirement in its underwriting manual that neighborhoods should remain occupied by the same racial and social classes, and any change in that composition, per the FHA, such as an increase in Black occupants, reduced stability and therefore increased risk. In short, the FHA, through its underwriting policies, prohibited insuring loans to Black homebuyers and ultimately also banned white homeowners from even renting to Black tenants. As previously mentioned, the third housing issue created by the Great Depression was a housing shortage, which the FDR administration addressed through the Public Works Administration, or the PWA. The PWA was established in 1933 to help people get back to work. One area of focus for the PWA was the creation of public housing agencies, also referred to as PHAs, and the development of public housing. Initially, public housing was designed to primarily house lower and middle-class white tenants. The federal government, along with local governments, implemented a neighborhood composition rule. Similar to how the FHA evaluated risk, the government decided the racial makeup of a public housing complex should match that of the surrounding neighborhood. Additionally, many, if not most or all, local PHAs implemented rules that did not allow Black tenants. Period. Interestingly, this left units sitting vacant as there were not enough white tenants to fill the units, and numerous black families were either homeless or living in substandard housing. Eventually, the rules changed and black tenants were allowed to rent public housing units, which in part helped lead to the creation of Suburbia, along with a push from the federal government to encourage white homeownership. How the government addressed the housing issues that resulted from the Great Depression will be discussed in more detail in the next few episodes, so be sure to tune in for those discussions. I'll also note for now, the New Deal isn't what pulled the U.S. out of its economic slump. It wasn't until World War II when lower and middle class Americans began to achieve economic stability. So stay tuned to hear more about that as well. Thanks for joining us so far. We'll take a quick break, and when we return, we'll hear from Quinn on the development of Suburbia.
Hey folks, Morgan here again. We hope you are enjoying the Unfair Housing podcast so far, and thank you for joining us. And remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you would like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. That's 800-875-8785. And to see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417. That's 800-405-1417. And don't forget, give us a like and a follow, and please share the series with your friends and family. Also be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X.
As white people moved out of public housing and out of the cities into suburban neighborhoods, the development of housing began to change. Single-family homes were the preferred housing structure, home lot sizes got bigger, restrictions on building size and structure were more commonly used, and new strategies were used to ensure these new neighborhoods were for white families only. For instance, in the early 1900s, Jesse Clyde Nichols, better known as JC, began building the Country Club District, a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. Nichols decided that by using restrictions in his contracts, he could increase profits while creating long-term stability economically and in housing. These covenants began as a few lines, eventually becoming many pages long. While the covenants regulated things like chimneys and porches and set minimum prices on homes, they also barred Black Americans from owning or renting in the neighborhood, stating that only non-Jewish white Americans could purchase or rent in the Country Club District. Nichols established homeowner associations to enforce his planned community's covenants. Homeowner associations can still be found throughout American suburbs today. The idea of a whites-only neighborhood may have started with the Country Club District, but it was perfected with Levittown. American soldiers returning from World War II needed homes for themselves and their families. These soldiers would find that there was very little housing availability due to high demand, and developers soon realized that there was money to be made in building more housing. Enter Abraham, William, and Alfred Levitt. In 1947, Abraham and his sons purchased land used for growing potatoes and onions in Nassau County, Long Island, in New York, and began building a planned community. The Levitts built homes with efficiency in mind, building multiple houses in an almost assembly line manner, rather than a single home at a time. Houses built by the Levitts were not only in a beautiful location and came with modern appliances and features, but most importantly, they were affordable. Within the next few years, this former farmland became home to over 70,000 residents. None were Black. The Levitts, much like J.C. Nichols, liked to control the people moving into the community. William Levitt only showed and sold homes to white buyers, refusing to show the homes to minorities, such as the Meredith family. Following the war, Robert Meredith founded a trucking business where he hired his nephew Vince, who helped expand the business by contracting to deliver building materials for Levittown to the Levitts. Vince, a Black soldier returning from the war, wanted a place to live, and after seeing its construction, decided to apply to live in Levittown. Unsurprisingly, his application was denied, and he had to move to Lakeview, New York, a Black neighborhood 20 minutes away from Levittown. To add insult to injury, because of his race, Vince did not qualify for the newly implemented VA mortgage benefit. Instead, he had to place a significant down payment on his new home and received a higher interest rate than other white buyers. a harmful practice that disadvantaged minority borrowers for decades. The Levitts wanted to make sure that the neighborhood stayed white even after they sold all their houses, so they included in the deed itself that the home could only be used or occupied by white people, and attempted to enforce the terms even after racially restrictive covenants in general were struck down by the Supreme Court. Since the Levitts could not legally enforce the restriction of Black Americans buying homes from white sellers, some Black families, like William and Daisy Myers, were able to purchase a home from white homeowners in Levittown. After moving in, the Myers faced nonstop harassment and threats of violence. A Confederate flag was flown in the neighborhood, the KKK symbol was painted on a wall next door, and crosses were burned nearby. Local police provided no support, and neighbors, angry that minorities had moved into Levittown, would gather around the Myers' home all day and all night to loiter and throw rocks at their home. They were worried that William, despite being an engineer by trade, would bring about lower property values, increase crime, and cause more Black Americans to move in. The Myers endured this harassment for several years, but ultimately decided to sell their home in Levittown and move back to the Black neighborhood in York, Pennsylvania, where they lived prior to purchasing their Levittown home. Here to speak with us more about the history of Levittown is Alec.
Thanks, Quinn. While the Levitts could not legally prevent Black Americans from buying homes in Levittown, the building of Levittown coincided with the shadow that was the Cold War. People across the United States were becoming weary of one another, believing anyone or anything different could be communist. At the time, people believed that the only way to tell if someone was not a communist was if they looked and acted the same, so the Myers' moving into Levittown was considered a communist plot against America by many neighbors. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a leading supporter of anti-communist activity, stated that public housing was a breeding ground for communists, and decided to work with the Levitts to promote Levittown as American, capitalistic, and anti-communist. McCarthy took photo ops in Levittown, praising it as the American way. William Levitt claimed that anyone who owned their own home and land could not be communist, as they were simply too busy, later saying that anyone who questioned his racially restrictive covenants was a communist. Levittown continued to grow in population, an all-white population. The stories of the Myers and the Merridays were not exclusive events. Countless other Black families experienced the same discrimination and were faced with the economic consequences that followed. According to the book, The Color of Law, homes in Levittown sold for $8,000 when the neighborhood was first constructed. This is equal to about $100,000 today. At the time The Color of Law was written, around 2017, homes in Levittown were selling for around $350,000, which amounts to over $200,000 in wealth growth for the white families who purchased in Levittown. Consequently, this also meant a significant loss in opportunity for the Myers, Merridays, and so many other Black families who were denied access to Levittown and the neighborhoods across the country that mirrored Levitt's discriminatory practices. To really put the loss of wealth into perspective, according to The Color of Law, the all-Black suburb Vince Merriday moved into after he was denied housing in Levittown is still approximately 75% Black, and the houses sell for only around $90,000 to $100,000, a far cry from the $350,000 price tag in Levittown. The Levitts' policies can still be felt today, as more than 98% of the people living in Levittown are white. To Levitt and McCarthy, homogeneous faces and buildings was the goal. Conformity was the only way to ensure American safety from communism and the fear of the unknown. Levittown was considered a success. Not only did many other developers across the country follow the Levittown plan, but Abraham, William, and Alfred decided to expand, building others in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and even one in Puerto Rico. Through the help of 1948's housing bill, Americans were able to purchase a house in the suburbs with 5% down and receive a 30-year mortgage. People who lived in the city found the process as easy as renting a home and cheaper. This led white Americans fleeing from downtown, leaving nothing but office buildings and minorities who could not afford to leave or who were restricted from leaving. To some, uniformity brought by Suburbia was seen as something to fight for, while to others it was something that had to be fought against. While racially restrictive covenants are no longer enforceable, other restrictive covenants are, such as uniformity in building structures and neighborhood appearance. The effects of J.C. Nichols and Levittown can still be felt in America today, as nearly 20% of Americans live in an area governed by an HOA. Nichols' preference for single-family homes and prohibition on apartments in his neighborhoods also resemble more recent zoning codes, which have predominantly favored single-family homes over more affordable multifamily housing. As you heard in today's episode, policies and practices implemented by the federal government to address America's housing issues following the Great Depression had significant negative impacts on hopeful Black renters and homebuyers. The policies that were meant to assist struggling white homeowners and new white home buyers that helped develop suburbia consequently resulted in widening the wealth gap between Black and white Americans and continued to keep Black Americans from fully participating in the American economy. Thanks for joining us this week. We look forward to having you join us next week as we delve into public housing and look at some Central Florida case studies in more detail.